Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me for week three, lecture two. Um, if you watched the first lecture, you saw that we talked about the Industrial Revolution. And for this lecture, we're going to be shifting gears, but definitely going to be talking about a topic that deserves far more than the amount of time that we have in this class to be able to talk about it. And I certainly wish that we could do it in person, but if during this conversation and this the lecture and the material that is presented, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out, text, call me. We can have more discussions because there's a lot more information here than what I'm going to be able to cover. You could do an entire course on this, an entire semester's worth of work on this topic just alone. But I am going to try to do it justice by talking to you about the issues of slavery and the abolition movement, and honestly, how exactly slavery, came to an end in the areas of North and South America, as well as throughout much of the world, or how slavery evolved into the forms that it is today. Because to say that we don't have slavery, that it's just that's just factually incorrect. There are still forms of slavery, not the type of slavery that many of us are familiar with, historically associated with in the North America as well as in South America. But there is slavery in the form of limiting one's ability to be able to freely choose a destiny for themselves because of the economic system that encapsulates this individual in terms of limiting what they are able to do. Okay. And so we're going to talk about some of those varying degrees of types of slavery, but we will be focusing on the ones that are certainly the most impactful in terms of the development of modern economies here in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So for this lecture, we're going to have a couple of objectives. So the first thing is that I want to define how slavery has evolved in terms of a system. Its origins, the type that we're most familiar with, and then we will talk about what type of slavery still persists to this day. We're going to look at the origins of, the factors that really created what is called New World slavery, the one that most of us learned when we were in grade school or high school. And we'll look specifically in terms of the type of slavery that develops in the Americas. Um, and then after that, we will take a look at the abolition movement and the factors that contributed to the eventual ending of slavery in North and South America. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I think most of you are probably aware of the fact that slavery is an institution that has been practiced on every single continent, every single society has had some form or type of slavery. Um, it is it's often misunderstood that the type of slavery that most of us are aware of that existed between the 17th and 19th centuries here in the United States and in South America, that this was the type of slavery that had basically persisted, for millennia. And that's just not true. The types of slavery that happened prior to that, which developed in North and South America, was a type of slavery that had varying characteristics, and we call that Old World slavery. This is the type of slavery that is associated with countries like Greece, Italy, the Empire of Rome in particular, or on the continents of Africa or Asia. And this is a type of slavery that was practiced roughly until about the 17th century. But the important thing to know about Old World slavery is that Old World slavery wasn't practiced in a way that it was determinative, right? You weren't born a slave. A person became a slave usually because of just bad luck, right? Debts. They become captured in war. They're sold into slavery for somebody to pay off, a debt that maybe the family owes. And so, because the condition of slavery was something that technically anybody could fall into, right? It's that if you fell on hard times, if your city is captured in war, even if you were somebody of status, you could still become a slave. And that's not to say that an individual, let's say, in Roman times, that if Rome attacks one of the port cities on the Mediterranean, like somewhere like the city of Carthage, or a place in Libya or in parts of Egypt, right? If they were to attack a major city and to capture, people who are of status. So these would be the leaders of the city, maybe a king, maybe a prince of some sort of noble person, right? These are individuals that they could become slaves, but they're not going to be individuals that are necessarily going to be working in the fields, right? Or going to be doing like manual labor. These are going to be individuals that have some sort of set of skills. And so most likely they are going to become individuals that are going to sit at the hand of the leader for whom took over the area. So, they may become an assistant. Maybe they become the servant of a noble person, right? These are individuals that still maintained a certain status, right? They're not immediately thrown into, menial labor. Why? Because these are people who actually have some sort of knowledge and skills. It doesn't make much sense to try to force somebody to become go into agriculture and they've never touched a agricultural tool in their life. You're going to be a very hungry civilization if you have, the people who are not well suited or capable or knowledgeable to be able to do the work that is necessary for, a society to survive. So when we're thinking about that type of slavery, we want to try to understand that it's not permanent, right? Somebody could get out of slavery. They could be purchased out of slavery. They could buy their own freedom. They could earn their own freedom, right? Through manumission. And these are also individuals that also had limited sets of rights, right? There were certain protections that were afforded. And you can click on this little link here that'll give you some of the examples of laws that in Rome, for instance, where slaves were protected. You couldn't just necessarily beat your slave to death. You couldn't just, physically abuse them in any sort of way, right? And so, this is very important for us to understand when we look at New World slavery, because the type of slavery that develops in North and South America, the ones that we are most familiar with in terms of our historical knowledge, this is a radically new form of slavery that gradually gets tied to a legalese system to where your position as a slave is tied to your birth status, so namely that of your mother. So if your mother was a slave, you were going to be a slave. So yes, could you be born into slavery? Was slavery a permanent condition for the most part? Absolutely. And so what we want to be able to understand is, well, why exactly does that happen? Right? Why does slavery develop so differently? Right? And it has largely to do with the changing economies that develop in the New World. And we will be looking at that as a fact. So that, the type of slavery that most people are familiar with in the 15th century when they are discovering, the new lands that are located in North and South America, when they are exploring these lands in the 16th century. There is a type of slavery that is happening, certainly, that there is a slave trade that is happening, right? But it is not the type of slave trade that we will become more familiar with as the 18th century and 19th century progress, right? This is a slavery in trade where it is maybe 20, 40, 60, 70 people on a boat, right? It is not the several hundred that it would become. And so in these early days, we still have this developing system of how exactly slavery is going to be a labor system and how it takes hold in the colonies is largely reflective of the economies that develop outside of the European sphere. Okay. So when we're talking about slavery, and when we think about how slavery gets tied to the production the need for labor in the areas of the Caribbean islands, Brazil, Mexico, and then, of course, in the in the colonies of North America. We have to first understand that, slavery, of course, is already present. Is slavery practiced in Europe? Yes. Is it practiced in parts of Africa? Absolutely. And in Asia and the Middle East? Of course it is. But one of the things that we have to understand is how exactly did we get from a system where somebody could fall into slavery because of bad luck into one where it becomes permanent. And it really starts off the coast of Africa. Now, off the coast of Africa, there are civilizations, there are people, there are kingdoms, and in particular, there is slavery that is that slavery, there's trading in slaves as a part of, economic exchange, where people are trading, precious valuables, spices, ebony, ivory, other, valuable feathers, ironworks, but they're also trading in slaves. And if we take a look here, like here along the coast, you have the west coast here of Africa, and then we have the southern west coast right here of Africa, like at the countries of, oops, so sorry, y'all, the countries of Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and of course, present day Zaire, the present day the Republic of the Congo, what was also known as Zaire. That these are areas where there are slave markets. And they're not extremely massive. We're not talking about thousands of people being sold, but there are slaves that are available, people that have been caught in wars, people that are in debt, right? And so we have what is viable slave markets, and people are trading and buying in slaves. Well, one of the things that starts this slave the what catalyzes the eventual type of slavery that will be established in the areas of North and South America begins off the coast of Africa with the Portuguese. As early as the early 15th century, the Portuguese begin exploring the northern, western, and southwestern parts of Africa, basically going around the coast. And what essentially they were trying to do was to, find another route to go to Asia, right? The land route that you would have to go through Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, through the Middle East, and then through Western Asia, all the way into, places like India and China. This could take, well over a year, maybe even two. But the problem was is that the route was closed, mainly closed off to Christians because of the Islamic empires that controlled the road. So it wasn't that, you couldn't go, right? But you were going to have to pay a hefty tax, and there was a possibility that you wouldn't be protected, right? So the Europeans are looking for another way, to get to the riches of the East. And so they begin to basically land hop. They go along the coast, and they eventually are able to make their way around the coast of Africa. And you can see here that there's several different destinations and basically the year that Portuguese people arrived, right? So you can see that they start over here on the islands of Madeira and, the Capo Verde Islands right here. So we're looking at, 1419, 1458, but making it over here to Elmina, present-day Ghana, in 1482, Cape Cross down over here in present-day Namibia, right, 1485, the circumnavigation, or actually circling the Cape of Good Hope, in 1488 by Bartholomew Diaz, right? And then eventually coming over onto the East Coast, like where Zanzibar is, and over here into India and into China, right? And so what they're basically doing is what is like an amphibious sort of, approach. They bounce from each side and they go a little bit further and a little bit further all the way down so they make it all the way around. And they're usually following the monsoon winds that are over here on the eastern coast, right? That would take you towards India and China and then bring you back. But what is interesting about that is as they are traveling around, they notice these economies and these, kingdoms and civilizations where they are trading in slaves. And so do they buy some? Certainly. Do they trade in some? Absolutely. And, what is interesting about this is that, many of these slaves, if you actually take a look, if you click on this image, it'll take you to a link. And I just want to show it to you. Whoops, went a little bit quicker than I had thought. Let me back it up. Whoops. Let me just back this up here for you. Can I move that? Oh, there you go. I just have to push it back here. There we go. Pause that. Okay. This is a platform that you can use, which actually documents the slave trade that was happening in between Africa, Europe, South, and North America. Okay. And what you can notice here is that it gives you the date. And then what you're going to see is you're going to see these little dots that are basically going to be traveling from areas in Europe, west coast of Africa to someplace in the islands. So you see the year, it's 1516. I'm just going to press play so you can see the little dots as they travel. Okay, you see that one that just came out, just stopped right here? So you can click on it and it'll give you the route. It'll say what the boat was. So it says Portuguese, all right? So the Portuguese were coming from where? This ship left the Congo River right here, and it left with 400 enslaved people and arrived in Lisbon with 298 in 1516. Okay. Didn't head to Brazil, didn't head to the islands, didn't head over here. It went straight from here into Portugal. But notice how many people they started with, and then how many people were left. Right? That's that's a 1/4 of the people on that ship died. How did they die? We don't know. But what we do know is that, and you can actually read more on this, it actually, if they have more data on it, you can actually find out. But, what's interesting is that, you can actually take a look and see like who are the people that own the ship, who were the enslavers, where it was coming from, where did it actually stop, which is interesting right here. Notice this, that the port of call that it stopped at was in Sao Tome. And this is actually kind of interesting because if you see that they started with 400 slaves and then they stopped with two, and then they arrived in Lisbon with 298, is it possible that everybody died? That maybe 1/4 of the people, perished on the ship? It's possible. It's also possible that some of them got off in Sao Tome. And let me show you. So let me go back. Whoops. There we go. Sao Tome is an island, and the island of Principe is right off the coast. So remember, the Congo River Basin is here. Stopped here in Sao Tome, and then it went all the way up to Europe. So is it possible that it stopped here? And the reason why I want you to think about why it might have stopped there is because when the Portuguese had made it over to the parts of the Middle East, parts of India, and parts of China, they saw that there was production in sugar. Now, sugar was not unknown to Europeans prior to the circumnavigation around the Cape of Good Hope by the Portuguese. Sugar was very much a crop that was present during the Middle Ages. It was mostly grown in areas where it was warm. So we're talking about areas like in southern Italy, parts of Cyprus, right in the Mediterranean, and in the Middle East. But it wasn't a massive product. It wasn't something that, was well understood in terms of its mass production. But that all begins to change. Is that when the Portuguese are exposed to new farming techniques that in terms of the production of sugar in areas of like India, China, and in the Middle East, they bring this knowledge and they try to figure out if they can try to recreate it in other areas that may be able to sustain this crop. Because remember, growing sugar requires a lot of water and it requires warm temperatures. So they try it on these two islands known as Principe and Sao Tome. And what they established there are basically what would eventually be called plantations. But these are still farms. They're large farms where there is a singular crop of sugar. And they begin growing the sugar to try to see if they can make it productive, right? And if any of you know anything about sugar production, it's very labor intensive, right? The sugar grows in these extremely high canes. It requires, physical labor to chop, to pile, to bring in. You have to crush the sugar cane, extract the juice, boil it, right, to extract the crystals and everything else, right? This is extremely labor intensive. And so what the Portuguese begin to do is they begin to try to figure out this system on the islands of Principe and Sao Tome. Now, this is not something that it immediately takes off, right? We're talking about you know, in the period of about, 1450, 1460, right? They're experimenting with it and they're trying to make it work, right? They're also trying to figure out, is there an actual market for this, right? Is this something, because sugar was a luxury, right? It was because it's difficult to grow and produce. It's labor intensive. So in order to extract all that sugar, you need a lot of labor and you need a lot of resources. And if there really isn't a market because only so many people can afford it, right? You have to be able to figure out how to make this product cheaper so that more people can afford it, so more people can buy it, so you can make more money, right? So this is what the Portuguese are trying to figure out. But what's interesting about that is that when you think about this system here, right, and what they were developing, is that we know that this system was being practiced in a couple areas, not just São Tomé and Príncipe, but we know that it was being practiced on parts of the west coast of Africa, particularly in present day Nigeria and Ghana, right? They tried to see if they could make it work. And it was successful in some areas, but there were other cash crops that became more successful. What's interesting though is that we do know that Christopher Columbus actually visited Ghana at the time, when they were trying out these new farming techniques. Now we don't know specifically if Christopher Columbus actually saw, actually saw, the farms on San Tomé or on Principe. It is possible that he may have. We don't actually have any proof or documentation of that, but we do know that Christopher Columbus was exposed to the slave systems and the slaves that were available on the coasts of Africa. So, now are they already thinking about how slaves can be used in this certain way? No, because if we can see where exactly this was going, and let me just escape this for a second so I can click on this. Um, and let me just get back onto here, right? Is that you're going to see that in the beginning here, most of the slaves that are going are actually going to end up in Spain, or they're going to end up in one of these islands. And so let me just play it for you, just so you can see some of the other ones. Okay. And you can see where we are, 1517, nothing there, right? And sometimes you have to be quick. You see where this one came out? Okay. So you see this one goes around a circle. Really actually quite interesting. Ship left Puerto Rico, unspecified, with 27 enslaved people and arrived in San Juan with 23. Okay. Interesting. And turns around, right? Did you see that one that came out from there? Ship left Seville in Spain with 10 enslaved people and arrived in Puerto Rico, unspecified with 8. There was another one. You see that? Right? And so what you want to do is just play around with this, because what's interesting is that what you're going to see is that as the economies here start to change, as the Portuguese and the Europeans figure out how to mass produce certain crops, such as sugar, you're going to see how slavery is going to increase, right? It's not that there aren't trades in slaves. Absolutely, there are. But if we look here, you see how quiet, how few there are, right, in terms of slaves, starts to pick up, right? Because more and more people are going to the islands. But let's bring it up and I'm just going to fast forward it, 180 years. And look at that. Every single one of these is a ship. And you can click on the ship, click on it and take a look. France. 869 enslaved people arrived in Martinique port unspecified with 619. Did they stop anywhere? No. They all got off in the Americas. Interesting. But take a look. Take a look at this, see what you think, right? Notice where all the slaves are coming from. Ghana, Cameroon, Gabon, Angola, Congo. Look at where they're going. Brazil, the islands, and then a couple go over here, and then a lot go to Mexico, right? What are they doing there? Well, they are labor, right? There's be no need for all of this unless there was a labor demand. And the labor that they're producing out here is going to be, you know, sugar and mining in Brazil, mining in Peru, mining in Colombia. There's lots of silver over here, lots of silver, lots of sugar, sugar in the islands. There's going to be silver and gold in Mexico. And then, of course, we have the developing farms. But remember, what's fascinating about this is that, as you can see, like literally, hundreds of thousands of people are being transported, right? The estimates are that it's somewhere between 60 million and 100 million people over this period of about 300 years, with survival rates of maybe about 50% in terms of the Atlantic cross, in terms of the crossing, right? Because all you have to do is just look at the ships and see how many people, 463, and arrived with 155. We might want to check on that to see if that's how many people died, or did they stop somewhere? No, they didn't stop anywhere. So that's a huge loss of people. That is a lot of people to be losing. That's over half of the people didn't survive this trip, right? So, when you think about this, take a look and ask yourself, when you're looking at these trips and these processes, how exactly does this take place? Now, what's interesting is that when we want to think about how exactly and why exactly slavery becomes established, as a system where it is tied to birth, we have to take a look at some of the early labor systems that existed under Spain and Portugal. And one of the first is what is known as the encomienda system, right? This is a Spanish labor system that was authorized by the monarchy, and it allowed Spaniards, people born in Spain, to basically find labor to run their farms, right? They could exploit native people, they could exploit slaves, they could also, use European labor, right? But what was clear is that based off of this, system, that there was a caste, right? Based off of how much blood you had tied to Spain, right? And this is basically what you can see there on your right is a essentially a physical demarcation that allows people to be able to identify who people are based off of how much blood, Spanish blood, they had and what they did in society, or more to the point, what they could do in society, who they could marry, jobs they could hold, etc. This system, which is interesting, is that you can actually look at this. This is actually a map that you can actually see in the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. And I actually went and visited, but let me play this for you so you can see it. You can see it up close. So you can see in where initially they start, right? This is a map that was made, that is based off of this caste system, this racial hierarchy that starts with those people who are most closely European, right? That's going to be these individuals up at the top. And then what this map does is it shows the entire area of Mexico, and then it breaks down the various regions based off of the individuals who are tied to Spanish blood. So let me just play it for you so you can take a look. Notice the clothing differences. Notice the coloration of their skin. Notice the tools that they have in their hands. Notice the type of work that they're doing, right? What type of labor are they, performing? Because your labor was tied to how much, Spanish blood, European blood you could claim. And this is that caste system, right? Is that based off of how much blood you had, you could be expected to hold certain positions in society. So the Spanish come up with this system where basically you have people who are born in Spain, right, are at the top. right? You were people who were born in Spain, pure Spanish blood. You're what is known as a Peninsulares. Then you have the people below them. These are the individuals called the Criollos. Now, the Criollos are individuals who are Spanish blood, but they were born in the New World. So these are considered colonials, right? So these are the people that are living in Mexico, the people that are living in Colombia, the people that are living, in Peru, right? These are individuals are, is that term. So they're Spanish blood, certainly, but they weren't born in Spain, right? To be born in Spain, that is the top, right? That is going to be very determinative of what you're going to be able to do in society, who you can marry, what is going to be your role, right? Criollos, certainly. You have the ability in which to, travel back to Spain. You probably have money because you are somebody of position of authority in the colonies, right? You probably send your children to Europe to be educated, but you make your money from the colonies in the New World. And of course, you are using labor. Underneath the Criollos, you have two groups. You have the mestizos and you have the mulattoes. Both of them have some degree of Spanish blood, but one is mixed with Indian, the other one is mixed with African slaves, right? So, same, right? They both are below, they both have two separate groups. And then below that, you have individuals that are natives and people who are black slaves, right? No degree of Spanish blood in either. Okay. This is be determined. So basically, the physical labor that Negroes and Indians, black slaves and Indians would be doing, these are the people who are going to be working in the mines. These are the people who are going to be doing the hardest labor. These are the people that are going to have the harshest lifestyle. The mestizos and the mulattoes, these are going to be individuals who are going to have, they may be able to know how to read and write. These are individuals that maybe are going to be working more in the business side. They're going to be individuals that can, possibly have, some sort of duty or role in the household society, right? But they are not the same as the Creole, and they are certainly not the same as the Peninsulares. Is there a degree of Spanish blood? Absolutely. So this is one of the reasons why when you look at countries like Colombia, when you look at countries like Brazil, countries like Venezuela and Mexico, you see a diverse range of people. And that is because you have a mixture of Spanish, a mixture of African slaves, and Indians. And then you have also the mixture of all the different types of, regions of Europe in there as well. And then, of course, the added mixture that will come in from immigration, people from Asian descent as well. So what we want to think about is that how exactly this goes, and this is solidified in law, right? It is determined who you are. And the reason why you have these images, like, oops, why is it going backwards? Okay, that's not good. Let me go back. There we go. The reason why you have these images like this is because this was meant to help people determine who are you, how much Spanish blood you have, what role do you play in society, what laws and opportunities do you have to follow, what are you able to do? And so when you begin to associate your performative behavior with a physical characteristic, and this is just through practice, then eventually it becomes solidified by law. And so what eventually we see in this system is that what develops in the Spanish labor system, the encomienda system, is something that is going to be borrowed by the people in North America. Because remember, ideas travel, right? People have these various notions and ideas of various groups. And remember, the ideas of race are developed in the 18th century, are being developed in the 18th century, right? There already are signs of difference that are being developed here in the 16th and 17th century. But remember, it is during the Enlightenment period, especially in the 18th century, when people are beginning to actually categorize people, right? That there's actually a Caucasian race, that there's actually a Negro race, right? That comes up with like Linnaeus and all these other individuals that are looking to try to scientifically define. But in that, before that, there's already a practice that is happening, right? That we have to distinguish ourselves because of people where they're from regionally, right? And it just so happens that based off of their region where they're from, they also look different. So we need to be able to know that we can define and identify people based off of the position they hold by how they look, right? And so this is very important when we think about the system that ultimately develops in the United States. So when we think about the colonies, right, we think about what's being developed off the coast of West Africa. We see what is developing in the Spanish and Portuguese held territories, how they're thinking about labor. Who can do what? What can we do? We want to think about the labor that happens in the United States. And I'm going to fly through this kind of quickly. But there's basically three forms of labor that they try in the United States. Okay. One of the first forms of labor that they try, as well as they tried in the areas that were controlled, conquered, if you will, by the countries of Spain and Portugal, was the natives. Okay, there are people that are already there. Remember, there's well over like 100 million people in both North and South America by the time that Columbus arrives. And so, remember that note that Columbus made is that, in his diary, he was thinking about how these people could be of use. That's something that I can do with these people in terms of what duties could they perform. And so in the labor in the colonies, they too tried the Native American element, right? Why not just enslave these people? They're already here. Well, there was two problems with that. The first problem is that if these individuals didn't want to work, all they had to do was just run back into the forest and, you couldn't find them. It was like, well, they know this area better than we do. We just got here. They've lived here their entire life. So they can resist and run back into the forest and we can't capture them. So there's the first problem. The second problem is disease. When Europeans arrive, they bring all sorts. Remember that Columbian exchange? That, people, they bring all sorts of diseases that, the Native Americans had not developed resistances for. And so immediately they are, decimated. Their population is decimated by smallpox, by measles, right? By the common cold, right? The flu, like these are all things that, Europeans had developed resistances to for over generations, hundreds and thousands of years. This group had not. And so they actually get literally mowed down by smallpox. And so that doesn't work. So then the next thing they try is indentured servants, right? People in Europe looking for passage to the New World, they sign what is known as an indenture, right? An opportunity, an agreement, a contract to where they will agree to work for a person who will pay for their voyage, pay for, some of their living expenses and maybe some of their food, and they will work off their time while they're here. Once their indenture is up, these are individuals who can now be free to try to buy their own land, earn their own income, et cetera, et cetera. Well, kind of a problem with that too, because what ends up happening is that, once the indenture is up, the person who was using this labor, right, runs out of it, right? They have to get another indenture, right? They have to get another person. They have to go through the process of training another person. And my God, isn't that just annoying, right? So there's already this problem in terms of a consistent pool of labor that is fixed, right? That they're already running into in the colonies. And so when we think about, that, right, we want to think about, well, what exactly and where exactly did they need this labor from, right? Aren't these just small farms and everything else? Well, yes, in part in areas like Connecticut and Massachusetts and those areas, right? But in the areas where we are, Chesapeake, Maryland, the Virginia area, right? All of this area, this is actually pretty good growing land. And it's pretty good growing land for, one thing in particular, tobacco. But if you're using, Disney as a way to understand history, don't do that because it's completely, inaccurate. But just so that you know, yes, Pocahontas was a real person, but no, she doesn't fall in love with John Smith. She falls in love with this other guy by the name of John Rolfe. John Rolfe has a charter from the king. He has an opportunity in which to get land, right? But he needs to make alliances. And so the best way to make alliances is to make friends with your enemies, the native element there. Well, one of the best ways to do that is to, make an alliance, marry one of the people. So that's exactly what he does. John Rolfe marries Pocahontas. And they marry because what John Rolfe wanted to do is he wanted to be able to access land that he could develop into a cash crop of tobacco. In order to do that, he needs to secure the land, but then he needs the labor as well. And so this is the reason why, one of the first things that happens in this area is that we can see the development of an economy that's based off of a single cash crop, not small farming, right? This is going to be industrialized, what is soon will be associated with this idea of mass production of a single crop for a market. In this case, it's tobacco. And so when you look at what's going on here, the marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe certainly was a marriage of convenience, right? You could make the argument that yes, they loved each other and everything else like that. And that, John Rolfe, makes the argument that yes, I'm trying to bring the heathen, to the word of God, and these are going to make good Christians and blah, 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 blah. But he really makes it clear. He really makes it clear in his actual letter, right, that he actually, makes in his letter to why he was marrying Pocahontas. And he says right here, he says, the glory of God and for the eternal consolation, blah, 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 blah. He's here to seek the shelter and everything else, the fervor of God, blah, 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 blah. All the good stuff, all the good stuff, all the good stuff. He's like, it's important for us to do that. And, we need to do the right thing because all glory to God, it's important, right? But, as he goes through this, very drawn out letter that he's writing to his friend, he makes it pretty clear, um, that all of the things that he's going through and all the things that, that all the things that he's doing is that he is trying to not just be a servant, to God, right? And to be this, he says it right here. He was like, to that end, the fruits may be reaped, the comfort of the labor in this life, and the salvation of the world to come. And if this be undoubtedly this, the service of Jesus Christ require that his best servant, him, right, John Rolfe, would have the instruments in his hands to be able to do the good work. All right. And that he's asking himself, he's like, well, what should I do? You know, should I, do the right thing and, be able to, get to know this person and, be able to, do all of the necessary things, with, Pocahontas and, getting married because remember, she's a savage. Okay. She is seen as ungodly. She is seen as somebody, like this is not, necessary, but he puts it right here. Like, it's like, you have to understand, like, yes, I'm doing this because it's necessary for God. I'm marrying this woman, right? But I'm also doing it, and he says it right here, for his glory, your honor, and the country's good, the benefit of this plantation, and for the comforting of one generation to the next, which I beseech God to grant for his dear son Jesus Christ for his sake. Right? Says it right there. I'm doing it for the benefit of this plantation. I'm getting together with her so that we can secure the land, so that we can get this tobacco crop on the market, and we're doing this. Now, if you want to make the argument that he was truly in love with her, okay, fine, be my guest. But let's just keep it 100 here, people. This was the reason why. Now, this is what's interesting about it, is that because they have this marriage, and in this marriage that they have children. They have several children, and they have generations of children. And the generations that of, the John Rolfe and Pocahontas marriage, there are people who are still live in Virginia that are related to these original individuals. What is so fascinating about it is that you can actually look up the race miscegenation laws that were passed in the 17th century and then again in the 18th century in Virginia, clarifying who could be a slave, who could own land, who could do this. There is a Pocahontas exception. They call it the John Rolfe and Pocahontas exception. Essentially, what this exception said is that yes, black people, if your mother was a slave, you are a slave. If you're born into slavery, you are a slave. This is how you can become a slave, etc., etc. And Native Americans know they can't own land except for the descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, right? They had to cut this in. Why? Because the people who are writing these laws, the elites, the people who own all the plantations in Virginia, all the land and all the money, well, guess what? It's the descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas as well. They've got money too. So you've got to make an exception because you're not going to be able to take one of the biggest landowners out of the equation here, right? If you get rid of them, what the heck are we going to be able to do? Okay. So it's in this beginning where you already start to see that the government, that the laws that are governing these colonies are already starting to take shape, defining based off of who could be an owner, who could be a slave, what are the duties, what are the labor, right? We're already starting to develop that. Additionally, the indentured servants takes a turn in the year of 1641. Okay, there is a fascinating story. It's about the story is known as John Punch. This is a likeness of John Punch. Now, I'll basically break it down to you like this. There are slaves that are in Virginia. Some of them are indentured servants. Some of them have been enslaved because they've been imported from Africa, but it's not a huge amount, right? There's still not those legalized forms of slavery to say that this group is only going to do this labor and it is going to be put down in law, right? We have this individual, John Punch. He is an indentured servant. Him and two other individuals, they're in Virginia. They just they just decide, one day it's a Dutchman and a Scotsman. And they just decide one day, you know what? This isn't for me. So they run away. And they run away and they get all the way to Maryland and then they get caught and they get brought back. And what's really fascinating about this case is what happens as a result. The court records point out, and what you can see this is in the colonial court and in 1632. And you have it right here, this case in 1640. Hugh Gwynn, let me see if I can actually make this a little bit bigger for y'all. There we go. Okay, right here. Scroll on down. July of 1640. Whereas Hugh Gwynn hath by order of this board brought back from Maryland 3 servants formerly run away from Mr. Gwynn, the court doth therefore order that the said 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping and to have 30 pieces called basically 30 they were charged like 30 shillings. So they have a whipping, they get charged a fine, and one is called Victor, a Dutchman, the other a Scotsman named James Gregory. So what those 2 individuals is that they shall serve out their times according to their indenture, and then they will have another year, right there, another year a piece of time until it's expired. Okay? By their indentures, they have to follow the laws of the colony, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But the third, a Negro named John Punch, shall serve the remainings of his time of his indenture for his natural life here or elsewhere. (1640). What exactly did the judge just create there? Well, the judge just established slavery for life. Now, we're not exactly sure why the judge did that. We're not entirely sure what the motives were, why exactly there were, 3 individuals who all committed the exact same crime. Why didn't they all get the same punishment? Well, you can clearly see that the judge decided that wasn't going to be the case. So as a result of this, the judge sets a precedent, right? That you can be a slave for life and that slavery can be a punishment for life. But he only associates it with one individual, and that's the individual who is Black. So now what he's done, this judge has essentially set the stage for local governments to establish slave laws, right? So we know that things have been building. We know that there's been slaves in the New World. We know that these economies are starting to develop. We know that people are practicing slavery in various degrees and forms. But now we have something in an actual precedent, which says that slavery can be permanent. It can be for life. That is very crucial for us to understand when we're thinking about slavery, because what that does is it starts to formalize the system. in the New World, right? It starts to be able to think, okay, so what can we do? And what ends up happening, you saw the case was in 1640, and look what happens. Massachusetts, first colony to legalize slavery in 1641. In Virginia in 1662, they determine that if a Negro woman's if she is a slave, the child is a slave, right? The condition of the mother, which is going to be practiced until the end of slavery in this country in 18 with the end of the Civil War in 1865. But you also see like that other laws are being passed, like the law of 1667 in Virginia, that doesn't matter. It used to be that if a slave was baptized, if they were Christianized, that they couldn't be a slave for life. They changed that, right? And you can see the other laws there. And why is this? Well, because indentured servitude is not a guaranteed form of labor. The Native Americans are all dying or they're running away. We have a new cash crop that is being established here with tobacco, with farming, with indigo, with rice. We need a secure labor force. And this is what they do. So what happens is that slavery gradually becomes something that is formalized. Slavery becomes associated with one group over time, right? It is not something that automatically happens. It is a process of various practices that eventually become legal policies. And that's what's very important to understand is that if we see how the varied forms of labor were tried and approached, the reasonings to look for a permanent source of labor and why it was so important to keep that labor in that position of service for life, be able so that they could guarantee a constant reliance on a labor that could produce. And so when you look at these laws, take a look, but it's really quite interesting, how these laws develop in the 17th century to formalize what slaves could and could not do. But where are they borrowing that from? From the Spanish, from the 16th and 17th century, right? And so you are already seeing that, they are coming up with their own systems. And also remember during this period, this is also the period of salutary neglect. So, they can come up with their own systems. They don't have to, ask England for guidance on this. They can decide for themselves what they want to do. And so that's very crucial to understand, because when we look at formalized slavery, when we look at how these systems develop, what are the punishments? What are the legal frameworks? What are the rules, right? We begin to see how this is very different from old world slavery. How the condition is tied to your birth stat, your mother's status, how your condition is permanent and for life, how your condition basically revealed that you were going to live in a constant state of servitude and that there was no way to get out of it. And this is simply to guarantee a labor force that can be counted upon to produce cash crops to develop an economy. And so, of course, we see slavery spreading, right? That's going to be the natural aspect of it. Every single colony had slaves. It is a misnomer to think there was no slavery in the North. Absolutely not. Slavery in New York, slavery in Rhode Island, slavery in Massachusetts, slavery in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin, one of the people who would eventually become an abolitionist, owned slaves. Okay. Thomas Jefferson, hundreds of slaves, right? This isn't a question, of accuracy, right? And if you want to, be a revisionist and be like, well, they didn't have it. They did. They owned people. And so we have to try to square ourselves with understanding how somebody can write such an incredible document that talks about the humanity and the independence and the freedom of the individual, and yet enslaved well over 150 people, had children with one of his slaves, right? It's humans are complicated, right? And history is messy, but we have to be able to, embrace that for what it is and tell it accurately so that we can understand why exactly these systems develop, that these aren't random, they're intentional, right? But they are the consequence of various developmental practices that eventually become formalized policies. Okay. So think about that. Now, as I've mentioned, the role in the colonies in the early period is obviously for tobacco, rice, and indigo. And the amount of slaves that are going to be passing from these areas and where they're going into the areas of North America and South America. The majority of slaves, just so that you know, and you can click on this link and it'll take you to the map again. Um, the majority of slaves, there's basically three stops from Africa: Brazil, Mexico, Caribbean, then North America, right? We're the third stop, right? The majority of slaves are going to be ending up in areas of Mexico and Brazil, and the Caribbean. If you've ever been to Panama, if you've ever been to Colombia, if you've ever been to Oaxaca in Mexico, there are entire communities that are Black. And these are the individuals who were brought, these are the descendants of people who were brought here as slaves and to work in the mines, right? And so they have a distinct culture. There are very much West Africanized cultures in dance, in language, in food that is present in areas of Brazil, in Colombia. Afro-Colombians. They're the vice president of Colombia is an Afro-Colombian. And so, it's important for us to understand how people get here, right? These are not immigrants. These people were brought here. They didn't have a choice. Okay. How you arrive matters because it matters in terms of you're affecting your status. And slavery as an institution, as one that, builds itself up, is from the moment that people are brought here, there is resistance. Take a look at some of the maroon societies and the slave rebellions that were common in the colonies, especially in the 16th and 17th century. It is not just in the 18th and 19th centuries where we have slave revolts. There were revolts all the time. Africans were resisting all the time. This is not just, oh, we just grab slaves and bring them on a boat and there's nobody's going to give us any trouble. Constant rebellion. The swamps of parts of North Carolina and Florida and Georgia become areas of maroon societies, areas where, former slaves would, go into the jungles and, live with other Native Americans there as a point of freedom, right? To be able to escape, the destitutes of slavery. But it is important to be able to recognize that because, it is not just simply, Africa, slave ship, plantation. No, there is resistance and rebellion. And remember, resistance takes on multiple forms. It's not just, overthrowing or, fighting against your captor or your enslaver. It could be simply, setting the sugar fields on fire, burning the crop, burning the cotton, tripping the master's kid in the fields, right? Poisoning the master, right? There is resistance in all forms. Very important to recognize that. But what I want you to understand is why slavery expands the way that it does, right? In particular, how slavery is attached to the how slavery catalyzed was the catalyst, excuse me, of our system of economics, our capitalist system of economics in this country. Why it is often called a peculiar system is not just because of the fundamental hypocrisies that exist within the system of people who could claim liberty and freedom for all and still own slaves. It's not just that. It is the peculiarity of a system in which it was discovered how to maximize labor through incentives. Now, what I just said there is what a basic economic, class would teach you is that economics is about incentives, right? This idea that if I am a rational individual, I will make choices that incentivize a certain outcome, right? A certain feeling, a certain experience. And so what happens in our system of slavery, this New World slavery, particularly in the 1810s and 1820s, as new lands begin to open up in the areas of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, as the Native Americans are moved out, white people move in, and slavery moves from the Old South, which is Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, moves down, right? We have a new form of exploitation where slave owners essentially figure out how to maximize production. If any of you have watched the movie 12 Years a Slave, there is a scene there in the basic, I think it's like in the barn, in the barn, when you see an individual, he's one of the individuals who works for the master, and he is reading out the amount of poundage each slave has picked for the day. What I want you to do is to notice in this discussion how the slave master is asking not only what did the slave pick that day, what did they pick yesterday, what is the average, and then what are they supposed to be picking for the week. You'll see that the person who's giving these numbers is reading it from a book. Well, this is where it begins, is that in the 1810s and 1815, is that slave owners began to figure out if they could keep records and data, right, based on the average performance of a slave, right? A basic slave in terms of how much this individual could pick in a day, the amount of labor. If we could quantify that in terms of a number, we could project how much might be able to be produced at the end of a week, a month, a year. Based off of those predictions in terms of the amount of slaves that you have, the amount of acres that you have in terms of land production, and how much you could produce, that predictability that is created through those numbers and that documentation can be used to invest. So this is how they do it. Through the use of incentives, basically the use of whipping and beating slaves to a point to get them to maximize their production, not kill them, but put them in a position to where they want to be able to maximize how much they are able to pick for fear of being beaten, etc. The slave owners and the management of these plantations keep these records and these documents. So over the course of a year, they're able to track how much they can produce per slave per acre. With this information, they begin to take this information to banks to say, well, I'm able to produce this much cotton with 20 slaves. If I could get 30 slaves, 10 more, I could produce this much based off of just a predictability factor and using algebra to find this out. Well, the banks start to notice this. And they're like, well, okay, so I can loan you this money at a certain interest rate. You buy more slaves, produce more, you pay this loan back, and you get more production, you make more money too. That system of using documentation, quantitative documentation, to be able to maximize the yields based off of physical labor is the basis of our capitalist system. That in terms of our system of labor, if we know how much an individual can produce based off of the incentives that get that person to work, I can predict how much I could produce at the end of a week, a year, 2 years, etc. This is how modern capitalism is born, not in New York, not in Boston, not in Philadelphia, not in Baltimore, but in the Delta, in the Mississippi Delta. The seat of finances and investment housing was in New Orleans. It wasn't in New York. In the 1820s through the 1850s, New Orleans was the place to be in order for investment. Why? Because human labor is your capital. It is your investment. These are people, absolutely, but these are people who produce. And your money is in these individuals, right? Because a slave is expensive, right? We're talking anywhere from $900 to maybe $1,200 to $1,300. That is an incredible amount of money. And right, so if you are paying top dollar for the top labor, you are going to extract that through a use of incentives, basically whippings and beatings, that be able to maximize that physical labor, to be able to keep that on the books and show averages so that you are able to demonstrate that to the bank so that you can garner more loans, more investments, more slaves, more output, more production. That's capitalism. And this is the reason why the system of slavery becomes so unique, and thus the reason why it is tied to a legalese system to where we cannot have individuals break away from that, because the entire economy of the South, as well as the banking system of the United States, depends on it. If you have people leaving this system, leaving this labor system, and it's not consistent, it's not predictable, we can't invest. Businesses love to have predictions based off of stability. They do not like panics. That's why they don't like, when President Trump is like, oh, well, I'm thinking of putting a tariff on, I'm thinking of doing this. That creates nervousness because we don't know what's going to happen. But when we have consistency, that's the reason why slavery is able to expand. And that's the reason why our system becomes one of the richest and most powerful in the world, because we use the labor system that maximized human output using quantitative methodology to be able to create sound investments that could then be used as you pull money from slavery, the benefits from that, you can invest in a factory. Because if you know that how much cotton is going to be produced, then you can have a factory to know how much cotton is going to be produced so that you can produce so many garments or that you can produce so many goods and services, right? This is how the economy works. And this was all developed here in the United States. That's why they call it a peculiar system, because it's a system that hasn't really been discussed. Now, you can take a look at some of the data and all the expansion and everything else like that, but I want you to try to understand how exactly we get to abolition. Now, as early as the documentation goes in terms of these slave ships, as early as the 16th century, there's documentation of how slaves are treated, the conditions on the boat, the people who were once slaves themselves, their documentation, their stories, right? Just because we had people that were supporting slavery doesn't mean that there weren't people in the period of the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century who abhorred slavery, who were against it, who argued, for its abolitionment. What is important to understand is that there were various tactics that were used in terms of ending, slavery in America. One of the first and most um, I would say productive to at least get people to really consider why we should end slavery were the rebellions that happened in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. There were slave abolition societies as late as the 1780s and 1790s. But what's interesting about that is that while they may have used tactics such as describing the conditions of slavery, the oppressiveness of the slavery, tried to use the tactics of people creating a sense of humanity or connection with slavery, the breaking up of families, right? All of these things are useful, but they don't seem to really make a huge dent in actually changing the legalese and the systems themselves, right? And what's interesting about it is that what was developing in the United States in terms of documenting slavery, recording the stories of former slaves, publishing this, having speeches, right, making friends with people who are in power. They did the same thing in Europe. And, the use of shocking imagery, testimonies, trying to develop a compassion for this, these were very effective, but they weren't effective in actually creating or actually getting people to move on ending slavery. And the reason is very simply this, is that there was far too much of an investment in it, right? It's not just that, it's not that, people didn't have compassion, but the compassion extended the length of a coin for many people. They're just like, well, this is business. This is money. Like, in order for you to really be able to end slavery a through a movement of compassion, you have to convince everybody. Everybody has to know that this is wrong. Everybody has to decide that this is a problem. Everybody has to know the dangers and the destructiveness and why it's bad, right? That takes years, decades, right? This is something that, may take forever. And yes, does shock and imagery work? Do testimonies work? Absolutely. A lot of these things work. But one of the things that just didn't seem to make much of an effort is that the fact that what really gave an end to slavery, right? It wasn't the fact of people realizing that slaves were people too. That's always been present, certainly. But the true motivations for ending slavery really were actually practical, right? They were actually practical because the system was no longer as effective as it used to be, that it had basically lost out. Like if we take what happened um, in Europe, right? The reasons for ending slavery were really largely just economic because because Europeans were going through the Industrial Revolution at the time, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, and there was just a need for, paid wage labor, and the use of large agricultural systems just sort of fell out, right? It just didn't really work there in Europe. But what's interesting about that is that the Industrial Revolution in Europe was actually spurred on by slavery. I'm wondering if any of you can guess what exactly the Europeans were developing um, in 1750 and 1760 and 1780. Like if you go back to here, and we'll go right here, right to when up here the Industrial Revolution is taking place. What do you think they're producing for these ships to carry all these slaves in? What do you have to put the slaves in that they could produce over here um, using the resources that they had in England, right? What exactly did they have in England? Well, they had lots of iron ore, coal, magnesium. All of those things, when you combine them together, makes steel. They were making chains. Yeah, chains for the slaves be transported. That's what contributed to the um, to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. But how it ends? Well, we know how it ends in this country, right? I mean, Civil War. It wasn't because people thought that it was the right thing to do. It was a necessary thing to do, right? The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was a war measure. It was intended to be able to disrupt the Southern economy, to give the North a chance to win, right? Slavery, if you look at the abolishment of slavery in terms of an actual like right and just thing to do, you need to look to countries like Brazil and Mexico, because these are individuals, especially during the Spanish American War, or the Mexican War for independence from Spain. Many of the generals that would declare independence for various regions, whether it's like Sonora or Pueblo, or areas in the various states in Mexico. These generals, many of whom were descended from slaves, ended slavery in their area. It wasn't the fact that everybody got together and thought that it was a good idea. It was usually just the work of one or a few people. What I want you to always know about, whether it's slavery, whether it is the right to have an abortion, whether it is the right to marry, the right to vote, that oftentimes the rights that are granted to a minority group from a majority usually do not come because the entire majority agrees, right? It is usually based off of a few people, whether it's a Supreme Court decision, a president in his proclamation, some representatives in government, right? So always know that slavery ends in terms of its formalized system in these regions in the Western Hemisphere, not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the expedient thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do. It was the better approach, or what was needed at the time, not because it was the right thing to do. And that's very much the reason why slavery still persists to this day, right? We still have slave conditions. You have slavery in the forms of sexual trafficking. You have slavery in terms of child labor. You have slavery in terms of children warriors, or being enrolled in military combat units, right? Slavery is always going to be that which fundamentally limits the individual's manifestation of choice and control over one's own destiny. Slavery is that curb that prevents that from being manifested. And so long as it persists in various regions on our earth, it has just developed and evolved in a different form. But it is still at its heart an extremely evil, oppressive, and destructive system. Okay? So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out. But I greatly appreciate y'all.